Hello, everyone, and welcome to History Inscribed, Paper Assets and the Stories Behind Them. Now, today, in honor of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we have a letter from the office of a declaration signer, James Wilson. Now, James Wilson is not the most well-known of the signers, but he is a very interesting signer who was also involved with the Constitution, land speculation, and the Supreme Court as well. So this should be an interesting document to get into. This document dates back to 1773 in south central Pennsylvania, Cumberland County to be exact. And I got this for about $55. And I think this was a good deal because even though it has a few condition issues, it was under-researched. The seller did note that it was a legal document from the office of Wilson, but they didn't go into any detail, and I think that turns a lot of casual buyers off sometimes. They also either missed or chose not to discuss a key signature on the back, that of Ephraim Blaine, who we'll get into his story as well. But first, I want to explain what this is. This is called an ejectment, which is basically a real estate title dispute. And it uses very interesting, antiquated language by our standards. I'll just read the beginning to you here. It says, Timothy Turnout, late of Cumberland County, yeoman, was attached to answer Peter Peaceable of a plea. Wherefore with force and arms at the county aforesaid, he entered into a missuage and 700 acres of land with the appurtenances lying and being in Peters Township in the county of Cumberland aforesaid, which John Andrew demised to the said Peter for a term which is not yet expired, and ejected him from said farm, and other wrongs to him there did to great damage of the said Peter, and against the peace of our sovereign Lord the King that now is, and whereupon, okay, so I think you've got the gist of it. This is boilerplate English common law language, and what they were doing here is called a legal fiction. I'm not a legal scholar, but this is what I was able to deduce. They were basically the British judicial system in North America moved very slowly, and it was kind of a mess. So they used this legal fiction, which everybody understood. The judges, the attorneys, everyone understood. It didn't actually happen, but this is how they justified pushing a title dispute into the court system, basically moving it up to kind of like the level of a criminal complaint almost, to get it dealt with instead of it's sitting in the court system for years. So Timothy Turnout and Peter Peaceable, these are not real people. This is part of the legal fiction. This is basically what they had to say in order to advance the case, if that makes sense. So it kind of shows how the British legal system was convoluted. It wasn't serving the colonists' needs. It was very difficult for the average person to navigate, a lot like today, honestly. And at the time, Cumberland County, which the area we're talking about here is nestled at the foothills of the mountains in south central Pennsylvania. It's about 30 miles west of Gettysburg, near Fort Loudon and Tuscarora Mountain. That's the area we're talking about. It's hard for us to believe today, but that was the frontier of British settlement at the time, at least organized settlement. People had pushed over the mountains, but that was in violation of British law. You were not allowed to settle west of the mountains. And so that was a big complaint the colonists had too for the Revolution. It wasn't just taxes. Was also they wanted to settle the western lands. So this was at the edge of permitted British settlement, and what was going on at the time was a lot of the earlier claims from the previous decades were now being formalized better, and the claims that had been a mess, property boundaries that were overlapping and such, were getting cleared up in court. And if you wanted to do that in central Pennsylvania, James Wilson was your man. He was considered one of the key top real estate lawyers in the area. And this was his kind of his go-to were these ejectment claims. There are a few other interesting things here. We can see John Doe and Richard Roe, the pledges of the prosecution. Once again, not real people. This is boilerplate language. And we see Mr. Fleming. Mr. Fleming was the defendant in this case. So they had 700 acres of land, the Flemings, and this other person, Andrew, he had a claim to it, and they were using the court system to try to clear this up. We can see once again, 30th of August, 1773. So that's what this legal notice is about. Now I want to talk about, one more thing. We can see James Wilson's name right here. This is the said Peter by James Wilson, his attorney. So James Wilson would later, in just less than 2 years, the revolution would break out. In less than 3, he'd be signing the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so let's talk about James Wilson, and then we'll look at the other signature on the back and talk about him as well. So James Wilson, he was born in Scotland in 1742, came to the U.S., or the colonies as they were then, and he studied under John Dickinson, who you probably recognize that name. He's one of the key forces in Pennsylvania at the time, and became the main opponent to independence. And James Wilson was considered a top lawyer, but he did not have the high personal reputation of some of the other founding fathers. He was considered kind of out for himself, didn't really have these high ordeals, didn't express big beliefs in liberty or anything like that. He was basically a legal shark, but nobody could deny that he was a top lawyer. And so that's why he was included in the Continental Congress and the early founding of the U.S. Is just he had a sharp legal mind. And James Wilson, he's really more involved with the Constitution than the Declaration. He did sign the Declaration. He did vote for independence, but he would be more of a driving force in the Constitution, where he's remembered for developing the 3/5 Compromise, along with Roger Sherman. And the 3/5 Compromise was where they gave more power to the southern states by counting 3/5 of the slaves as part of the population there. So he also believed in popular sovereignty, which was that the people should have a voice in the government. And Wilson really was also in favor of a strong federal government as well. So Wilson's kind of a mixed bag. He did some good things. He did a lot of questionable things. One of the things during the Revolution that he's known for is the Fort Wilson riots. And Pennsylvania was very radical, actually, during the Revolution. They had one of the more radical state constitutions. And Wilson was known as a stickler for the law. So he actually defended a lot of the people in Philadelphia, where he was living at the time, defended them legally against charges of corruption and so forth. And he believed that everybody should have due process. Well, this didn't sit well with a lot of the more radical types in Philadelphia. So they actually had an incident known as the Fort Wilson riot, where angry citizens surrounded his home in 1779. His home was at 3rd and Walnut in Philadelphia, and actually several people were killed there. He had packed his house with the more conservative supporters, and this liberal faction or radical faction attacked. And so he has kind of a mixed history during the Revolution. He was not beloved by all, like maybe a few of the other founders. He was much more of a controversial figure. Then after the Revolution, he became a Supreme Court justice. He was one of the original Supreme Court justices. Then he became involved in land speculation, and he bought enormous tracts of Western land. This collapsed, of course, in the 1790s, and he actually went to debtor's prison. And then he fled south to North Carolina and became a judge, where he had a stroke and died in 1798. So that is the story of James Wilson. He's a very interesting figure, a lot to him. He didn't just sign the Declaration and then vanish like some of the other signers, or kind of fade into obscurity like some of them did. He was very influential, but at the same time, he's really forgotten by the average person nowadays. Okay, so let's look at the back of this document, the verso. All right, so here on the verso, we can see that the clerk entered information onto this document in order for it to be filed and found quickly. And we can see the clerk signed Wilson's name here. It says Wilson. I believe that's pro for protho notary. I'm not entirely sure, but this is basically saying Wilson was for the plaintiff. We see the date as well, 1773, an ejectment. We see the fictitious names along with the real names. Notice given to Widow Fleming. So it's possible that this was given to Fleming's wife, who was managing the 700-acre tract of land, which that would be the only way she would be able to do this, is if Mr. Fleming had already died. And here we see what I believe is the key value driver of this document. If you look here, you see EPH Blaine, SHFF, and that is Ephraim Blaine, Sheriff. And this is the second man involved in this document. He is another forgotten founder. Did not sign the Declaration or the Constitution, but he served with the Army. And Blaine has an interesting story. He was much more of a frontiersman than James Wilson. Okay, we'll go into that in a minute. I also just want to point out here that you can see here it says miles 45, I believe. Could be 48, but I think it's 45. This is Blaine indicating his mileage to be reimbursed. So he rode 45 or 48 miles with this document in October 1773, I believe, somewhere between August and October 1773. He rode 45 miles through south central Pennsylvania to deliver this piece of paper to the widow Fleming. And so this was the way he was reimbursed for his mileage one way from the courthouse to the farm. So that's how we know exactly where this was. Peters Township would be present day Franklin County, Pennsylvania, because even though it says Cumberland, Cumberland was like the mother county, and then it was subdivided. So this is he rode that mileage, and that mileage checks out. I always like to check and see if I can find any physical identifiers that confirm the document, and of course it does. It's about 46.9 miles from Carlisle to this area, so he really knew his mileage there. And let's talk about Blaine's story. Blaine was actually born in Ireland in 1741. He moved to Pennsylvania when he was 4 years old, and he grew up in central Pennsylvania. At that time, though, that was the frontier. And he traveled to western Pennsylvania as well, which was over the mountains, and that was really the frontier. He was present during the French and Indian War in western Pennsylvania. I wasn't able to find out exactly what capacity he served, but he was too young to really be a soldier. I think he was a trader, in other words, a trader of goods. And I think he worked with, trading posts and that kind of thing. He definitely was present at Fort Pitt during Pontiac's rebellion, which followed the French and Indian War, and he was subject to a siege there for 2 months in the early 1760s. So he led a very tough frontier life compared to some of these other founding fathers. And when he went back to central Pennsylvania in the 1770s, he started to enter these local political offices. And so he was the sheriff of Cumberland County at this time. In the early 1770s, that's where we see him dealing with this letter, serving these notices. He would have had a lot of legal notices like this and would have ridden out and delivered them all. That would have been one of his duties as sheriff. When the revolution happened, he sided with the rebels. He became a colonel in the Pennsylvania militia and eventually caught the notice of George Washington, who made him commissary general for the Middle Department. And this is where he performed his greatest feat, which was at Valley Forge, where he was in charge with feeding the army. So that's really his claim to fame, was getting the army physically through the winter at Valley Forge. Other generals provided leadership training, that kind of thing. Well, Blaine was one of the ones actually making sure they didn't starve. And Blaine actually got more and more responsibility after Valley Forge when the quartermaster department was taken over by Nathaniel Greene. They recognized Blaine was a very, very competent official who could get things done. It probably goes back to that training on the frontier during the French and Indian War, where he really learned how to feed an army, how to gather cattle, how to supply troops in the field, how to make deals and do what was necessary and that kind of thing. So there's not a whole lot of information on him. We don't have any portraits or photos or anything. We do have one of his great-grandson who ran for president, actually. His great-grandson, James, who ran for president as a Republican in 1884, but lost to Grover Cleveland. So that's probably the closest likeness we have to Ephraim Blaine 100 years earlier. But it's a really interesting document. So what can we learn from this document overall? I think this document shows us that the founders, they were not these demigods that were just all about liberty and advancing the cause of mankind. They were very mixed people, very flawed individuals, and a lot of them were just concerned with more mundane things like their personal wealth and advancement. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but this is only, what strikes me is this is only less than 2 years before the fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord. And, we have the same men who would be fighting the British Empire doing things like this, where they're just concerned with a legal dispute, in a frontier backwater. Really, they really, I wonder if they really knew what they would be doing in the next few years. Totally different than what they thought they would be doing, probably. There's one more thing here, and you can see kind of the faint outline of the embossment or seal. I'll see if I can get a better photo of that for you, but it needs a bright light to show up. But that's an interesting seal right there to look at as well. Faint outline. You can see the tape repair as well. I didn't do that, but this document is quite fragile. It's a little bit brittle, it's starting to come apart, so we need to get it back into storage. But I'm glad I could share it with you on the eve of the 250th anniversary here and talk to you about these men that have mostly been overlooked by some of the bigger founders like Adams and Washington and Jefferson. I find it interesting that Wilson was almost killed in the Fort Wilson riot for doing the same thing that John Adams gets lauded for, because, as we know, John Adams defended the British soldiers at the Boston Massacre, and that really enhanced his reputation. But when James Wilson defended the more conservative people in Philadelphia, he almost got his house burned down. So it's just really interesting how history chooses to remember some things and not others. But I do believe this was an interesting buy and a good buy. So just keep in mind that if you're interested in getting into historical documents, you don't have to spend a fortune to get an interesting document like this. This was only about $50, and it will be preserved, and these men's stories will be preserved as well. So thanks for watching. I hope you subscribe, and we'll see you in another video.